Hello everyone, I'm Khyati Sehgal and today I'm here to make my presentation on tracing intellectual histories of women around alienation of women in the domestic sphere as a part of my paper. Labor is a concept given by Marx, which is defined as alienation is a process of transformation of own labor of the workers into an exploitative power that rules them, in which capitalist system monetary gains and profits are seen as the end. So cheap labor is very important to maximize these profits, and therefore workers are forced to perform the same repetitive functions over and over again due to division of labor to increase efficiency, leading to labor performing the same task and therefore reducing the labor to a machine. There is no regard for his emotional mental welfare, and there is no opportunity of any self-development, and they are forced to sell their labor as a commodity, and this leaves labor bereft of any control over themselves. Understanding alienation. So, the idea of alienation in the domestic begins in 18th century in a poem by Coventry Patmore, Angel in the House, which has also been mentioned by Virginia Woolf. The poet talks about women and their tasks, and the analysis of the poem reveals how the alienation of women takes place through their daily tasks. The poem also represents that how the destinies of women are always controlled and they are not allowed to be free and express themselves or their identity, which are always bound, and their destinies are controlled by the men in their lives, i.e. their husbands, just like capitalists who control the destinies of laborers, and similarly husbands that of their. Three parallels can be drawn between wives and laborers. That one, they're both caged, like women are caged into houses and forced to perform the same repetitive tasks again and again. Second, women prepare men to go out and work, so in a way the product of women is men, but just like the product of laborer is invisibilized, same happens to women, leading to their alienation. And the third is that the product that laborers produce becomes a tool of their own exploitation, because it is the men who ends up caging and exploiting women and controls their life. Next segment, tracing intellectual histories of women's ideas around the alienation of women. So I've tried to make a comprehensive timeline of the ideas of women around women's alienation in the domestic sphere which surfaced. We can have a look. That we're going to talk about. They can be psychological or emotional. Second is reproductive, and third is sexual. A lot of people also look at sexual and reproductive overlapping, but we can also draw a line there. So the first seminal piece of work that arrived in 1949 was The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, which describes the process of male alienation and links it to female alienation, leading how one leads to another, and argues that women are alienated due to their own sexual labor. Women are seen as reproducers, and their task is majorly to produce and cater to the babies, but the task of a man is to go out and become a social functioning being. But women remain inside, so they remain alienated, and they're also caged because they do not get a chance to enter into the social world in a way a male does. And due to male alienation in the capitalist world, like we talked about the alienation of labor, women are seen as the other, whose alienation is not even acknowledged, because women's tasks are in control of their husbands, who act as a capitalist acting towards a laborer, which we have also discussed earlier. The second important piece of work, which came about in 1969, was The Political Economy of Women's Liberation by Margaret Benston. In this important piece of work, she defined women in terms of the work they do. So it was a relational identity again. And just like the term capitalist or labor is defined in the context to the work they do, similarly, she drew a parallel, and thereby she argued that domestic work is unpaid and it happens in the family setting and is indispensable. So although Marx might regard it as unproductive because it's unpaid, it is not really unproductive, and it is more important and also indispensable. Sharja Patel also, in a survey by The Economic, mentioned that how women do a lot of unpaid labor which supports the economy, but if all of this is not done, then the economy might collapse, which we can also witness during this time of quarantine when all of these people are on leave. How are the houses being supportive? Moving on, so Benson argued that it is through this sexual division of labor in the household that keeps the social structure intact, and therefore it is also crucial to capitalism indirectly, as the production that is done through the domestic is not for exchange value, but it forms the material basis for the subordination of women. So even if it is not contributing directly to the capitalism, it is forming a understructure for the basis of it. And for that, women needs to be subordinate. And as capitalism creates a society in which money determines value, women's work in the domestic sphere is outside that monetary sphere. Therefore, it is unpaid, but also unacknowledged. And all of these reasons contribute to the alienation of the domestic sphere, which is an issue which the Marxists have conveniently ignored because this does not lie in the realm of capitalist structure. That comes is Femininity as Alienation in 1977 by Foreman, another woman, giving very important ideas. Till now, the other two ideas that we've looked have talked about the sexual labor, and Margaret Benston described that in the capitalist structure, how this unpaid labor in the domestic, as in the household work, the physical labor is important. Now, this another author, Foreman, discusses this in respect to the emotional alienation or psychological alienation, in which she says that men seek relief from their alienation through their relationships with women. But for women, there is no relief. For these intimate relations, there are the ones which are the essential structures of her oppression, in which she means that women always provide emotional gratification to the working member of the family. If they're frustrated or they're angry, they usually take it out on their wives or the women of the family. And woman especially has to offer the role of a comforter to her husband, which also becomes a form of oppression and exploitation of her emotional labor, because they feel alienated in the capitalist structure and seek support from women, due to which men fail to realize themselves as the oppressors of women, because whom do these women go to for emotional support then? And another important piece of work was the concept of alienation and feminism in 1982 by Slaughter. And in her work, she links between alienation and feminism, and she brings out a critique of the Marxist theory of alienation, which left out women very conveniently, which is carried out in different ways, like male domination, women's sexualization and objectification, and then suppression of women's sexuality. So another parallel or another idea on sexual alienation maybe. Then she draws parallels between women and labor and argues that just like the value of labor is decided by the products and skills, that of the women is also reduced to their body parts and their objectification. For example, how women are a lot of times reduced to just sexual objects, or even in the marriage market. And I say market because if you look at, women are advertised as a sum of what all they can do, maybe very homely, very beautiful, knows how to cook, gold rotis, or whatever. So another thing that Slaughter highlights is the fact that a lot of times this alienation is not acknowledged, as a lot of women find it satisfying and seem to love their chains, which is a very interesting idea, because she is arguing that, you know, sometimes women becomes the oppressor of women. So if we look at in our own Indian households, a lot of times you might see in joint family structures, the mother-in-law, you know, does the same things on her daughter-in-law, which she might have faced by her own mother-in-law. So the oppressor becomes the oppressed also becomes the oppressor. And this fact is also highlighted that, okay, this also becomes a form of alienation, because then whom do you go to for emotional gratification if another woman is also trying to, you know, just oppress you? Important work that I wish to discuss is The Sexual Contract, which came out in 1988, written by Carol Patman, which when came out created havoc around, because she was openly challenging the social contract, in which the ideas of philosophers like Rousseau and John Locke have worked upon. That she says that the social contract of individuals and the state is actually undergirded on a sexual contract, which is not brought to the forefront. And this is the main basis of the modern patriarchy, because if women are not disagreeing to it or questioning it, they are in a way agreeing to it. This is the underlying idea. And then she goes on to compare the lives of women as wives to that of slaves again, who are also bonded to a man, and the man can access her sexuality as and when, according to his whims and fancies, and use her quote-unquote services to his disposal through the contract of marriage, which he subsumes. And even if we look at the Hindu marriage law during the pharaohs, there is something like this contract of marriage, that there are 7 vows that you take. Then she talks about wife financially dependent on him, and if the wife is not going out to work but is working in the domestic, then that labor is unpaid and she is not getting paid. But in case she is also going out to work, then it becomes a concept of a dual labor, and her income is seen as a supplement to that of the husband. And even then, only husband is given the financial control of the household a majority of times, and therefore also the responsibility of domestic chores still falls onto the woman, which Nivedita Menon also in her work Seeing Like a Feminist speaks about, that it is a woman who is, even despite being working, is responsible for the household chores. Like if you are appointing a maid, then it would be the woman looking into the affairs of the maid, how they are paid, what work are they supposed to do, and telling them, disseminating work and all of that, looking into the household issues, which also lead to their alienation in the domestic sphere. Not talking about how it affects in the capitalist structure, but how in marriage, just like that of a slave in a bondage. So she's trying to draw parallels between bondage and marriage. That the idea of a woman, the category of women itself, is not a homogeneous one. It is very heterogeneous. There are trans women, there are women of color, and there are a lot of intersectionalities of caste, class, and race. So I tried to include the Marxist feminist framework around alienation and the intersectionalities, in which I would be discussing Border and Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins and Martha Gimes, all 4 of them. So Martha Gimes, beginning, talks about in her work about loving alienation. So there's this particular chapter in the book Loving Alienation, which talks about the contradictions of domestic work, looking at how the advancement in the field of science and technology have impacted the sexuality and reproduction. So basically she talks about surrogacy, and then she talks about women's labor, education, and challenging gender roles and the sexual division of labor, like how the technology has impacted all of it. Like with the coming on maybe fully automatic washing machines, it is still the woman doing it. And even if you look at those ads of the household or kitchen items, it's always the women doing it. Then Patricia Hill Collins, in a very important work, Gender, Black Feminism and Black Political Economy, she uses the intersectional Marxist feminist framework again, in which she, analyzes various intersections of gender, consumer racism, and she's also highlighted issues of Black women, which focus largely on family, with a lot of intersections on class, caste, race, sexuality, sorry, not caste, but also gender, and how it can have a larger economic implication, which helps us locate alienation in the domestic, also implicated by the ways it takes place across genders and races. So if it's happening with the white women, similar kind of alienation is also happening across races with white women and across genders through trans women or cis women. So that is how she's traced all of it. Then intersectionality, there's another work by Kimberly Crenshaw in which she talks about how all of these experiences of women inside the domestic spheres are intersections of both racism and sexism. So in Indian context or in other context, and in Indian context we can also include casteism and sexism, but these experiences are always unregarded and not represented in the larger feminist domain or in the casteist or racist discourse also, because they're seen as normal and not as alienation. So we might not always regard them, and we might just see them as, they're just daily experiences. Another important work, and the final work by Boer, which I'm going to discuss, is a histograph in which she discusses how Marxism and intersectionality critique each other, which she mentions that how Marxist feminist discourse has included race and class for intersectional analysis, but which was not present before. I would like to only add that I've tried to trace various ways in which alienation has been happening, but I also realized while doing this that how the theory of alienation is very narrow. It needs to be more stretched and more worked upon to include myriad other ways that women might be facing out there, like sexual labor, including sexual violence like genital mutilation and marital rape, or reproductive labor and its commodification through surrogacy and other ways, and other things like the pro and against debate for prostitution legalization, or if we talk about in the modern world dating, not just for cis women but also looking at how dating apps are looking at, or creating obstacles, or maybe you know um, maybe creating obstacles or disappearing the lines for also trans women, what are the challenges they might be facing, how it leads to their alienation, the idea of identity and psychological alienation, like how identity is shaped through socialization and how women also become alienated in the process of the same. What if you feel a dysphoria? What if you do not relate to your own identity that you have been given? But all of this helps us understand on a closing note that we can locate all of the alienation amidst the global capitalism and imperialism, and look at how alienation has been shaped by all of these factors together, and also how this phenomena was unregarded and unacknowledged for a long time until women started producing knowledge around the same, because it was their problem per se. And despite this phenomena being faced by women across the globe, the Marxists were not talking about it. Women were just left out of the conversation, while all of the women across the globe, irrespective of their intersectionalities, because this phenomena of alienation, as I try to trace, has been cutting across all the gender, class, caste, race, whatever, but it was still unacknowledged. And all of this only came to the surface when we women started producing knowledge around the same. So thank you for listening. Thank you, ma'am, for giving me this opportunity to try and trace this. I hope you guys liked it. Thank you.